So can we start by having you tell us your name, current position, and institutional affiliation?
Sure, I'm Randy Harris. I usually publish under Randy Allen Harris. I'm at the University of Waterloo, Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, the Department of English. I'm a full professor there.
And can you talk a little bit about some of your current research related to the rhetoric of science?
Well, mostly these days I'm interested in cognitive rhetoric. That is, the way in which the structure of the mind responds to arguments and suasions and inducements of various sorts. The most famous of these, of course, is metaphor, which has been researched by cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind and psychologists for a century almost. Well, longer if we go back to the early modern period and the classical period. So metaphor, everyone understands, corresponds to a kind of comparative way of thinking and arguing. But it's only one of many tropes. Metonymy correlates with a kind of set theoretic way of understanding things. Synecdoche corresponds with a part-whole sort of way of understanding things, that structures in the world have components. And so there's a number of fundamental ways that we think that are reflected in tropes, but tropes are only one type of figure. Schemes as well reflect the way our minds structure and understand the world. So edge detection, for instance, is important in perception and cognition, and repetition is important in the way our very brains are structured. They operate in terms of repeated firing patterns. And repetition works if you want to remember a phone number or a name or an address. You repeat it over and over to yourself again. And figures schemes work a lot in terms of repetition, and repetitions happen at boundaries, at beginnings of clauses, beginnings of words, alliteration, ends of phrases and words. So all of these cognitive structuring patterns are fundamental to the way we understand, think, argue, believe, and I've been looking at how they permeate scientific argumentation. Most recently I've been looking at Mendel's work and how his central expression, the way he captures the dominant and recessive relationships of his experiment is encoded in antimetaboly. That is an inverted repetition. So I meant what I said what I meant. That's an antimetaboly. But it also capitalizes on repetition, ploche, and symmetry and other structures of the mind. So cognitive rhetoric is my main bailiwick, and I've been applying that to rhetoric of science in various ways lately.
And what drew you into the research, into researching the rhetoric of science?
Coincidence, happenstance more than anything. I was on an English literary kind of trajectory. I'd done some degrees in that. Then I also took a degree in experimental psycholinguistics, just sort of figuring out what I was going to do. But amongst those degree pursuits, I'd lost affection for academics. Still loved research, but didn't really want to participate in the academy. And looked around for places where I could get a commercial degree that could take me out, and I could work in corporations or NGOs or the like, and that brought me to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in the mid-1980s. And amongst the faculty there were two superb rhetoricians of science, Michael Halloran and Jim Zappin, and a core of really interesting doctoral students who had similar overlapping kind of interest, and that just drew us all together. They didn't have a course in rhetoric, rhetoric of science, and I didn't understand rhetoric very much at the time, but I'd been involved in reading a lot of popular science, and my psycholinguistics degree, I'd seen some disputes in linguistics, and I was interested in how scientists, as these supposedly uber-rational creatures, ran into conflict and couldn't agree about the same data looked at through the same instruments and so forth. And so a bunch of us got together and approached Jim Zappin about a directed reading course, and he kind of babysat us for a while. We looked at the work of John Lyne and John Campbell and Alan Gross and Jeannie Fanistock and Carolyn Miller, who was an alumna of RPI at the time, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And that just got me interested and got me fascinated. And I ended up applying it all to a dispute in the then recent history of linguistics between Chomsky and some of his disciples in the early to mid 60s into the early 70s. Wrote my dissertation on that. Later came out as a book, Linguistic Wars. So that's how I got into rhetoric of science.
And what can you tell us about the history of ARST and your involvement with it?
Well, I don't know if you recall, but when it started, it was the AARST, so American Association of the Rhetoric of Science and Technology, and I'm a Canadian. I was in Canada, so I looked at it from abroad, and I knew some of the folks involved in it through the reputations. John Campbell, I admired hugely, and so I was interested in the formation of it, but I wasn't involved at all. And then I've come to several ARST conferences throughout time. As the American dropped, I came a bit more often.
Do you recall any memorable moments from those meetings? Any particular?
Well, almost anything involving John Campbell standing up and telling people that they were on the wrong side of one question, and other people in generating hallelujahs and amens, and anything involving John Campbell is memorable in the ARST meetings.
So it's the 20-year anniversary of ARST. Looking back on the last 20 years of the field of rhetoric of science, what do you see as the significant intellectual tensions or sticking points that sort of stand out?
Well, in the early days, the question about how epistemically involved rhetoric was preoccupied most people, and it's something that drew me to rhetoric of science and technology. The sense that we make knowledge through arguing about our understandings and negotiating with each other. That preoccupied a lot of us. In terms of sticking points, perhaps the most significant event was the Gaonkar affair, where he published an all-out assault on rhetoric of science and rhetoric of anything, in fact, that wasn't just simple productive speech models. And that raised a lot of ire. It came out in a special issue of a journal and then in a book, Rhetorical Hermeneutics. I think Gaonkar had it all wrong, and most of us did. There have been two effects of that, of the Gaonkar affair. One, the most important probably is how John Campbell characterized it. It was good for business. That is, a lot of rhetoricians responded to Gaonkar almost universally, pointing out that rhetoric had always been a critical as well as a productive model, that it had always incorporated new technologies and new tools and new understandings as it developed over its two-millennial history, and that it wasn't restricted to simply telling people how to design forensic speeches, that there was much more richness in the tradition than that. Just getting up and talking about all of this, and talking about this in the context of science and technology and argumentation over knowledge, I think invigorated the subdiscipline and really gave it a new, renewed life at the time. The second effect is that Alan Gross, who was one of the major targets of Gaonkar, perhaps the only rhetorician who really felt the sting of Gaonkar's accusations. That is, he took Gaonkar's objections to his work quite to heart and tried to restructure his work. In fact, did restructure his work very dramatically. And he's still doing very interesting and productive work, but he's become less and less affected with the term rhetoric for doing it, and he's drifted away to more directly communication sorts of studies. So a major contributor to rhetoric of science and technology has moved out of the main trajectory of rhetoric of science and technology these days over to communication of science.
So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about some of the biggest challenges facing the field as it began to develop, and maybe some of the challenges today. And I understand you have a story about Kuhn and his reticence to contribute to the landmark essays volume.
Yeah, well, no, almost, but let's, yeah. So I think the main challenge with rhetoric of science and technology and medicine hasn't changed, and that is the low esteem with which the word rhetoric, Jeannie Fanistal calls it the R word, is received almost anywhere except rhetoric. I think this is changing, but early on, when I was trying to get people to contribute to allow me to collect their work for a volume I produced called Landmark Essays in the Rhetoric of Science, I approached Gerald Holton, who did some very fascinating work on themata, large appeals in science, and how scope and simplicity and specific appeals like the appeal of fragmentation to the quantum theorists, how these appeals structure the way they argue. And he was quite interested in it. I was very enthusiastic about his work and corresponded with him about it. But when I suggested that there was a correlation with Aristotle's topoi, he completely blew up and wouldn't associate his work with rhetoric at all, and just pulled out of the project. Wouldn't allow me to publish this section of his book that I'd wanted to publish. I also was corresponding with Thomas Kuhn at the time, and Kuhn is more than anything prepared the ground for what we were pursuing in Rhetoric of Science and Technology and Medicine, and he was also horrified that the word rhetoric would be associated with his work, and didn't understand it at all. And yet he's the one who said in Structure of Scientific Revolutions, we need a new study of scientific argumentation, one which attends to persuasion, which has always been the key word of rhetoric. So the R word is not received very well outside of our discipline. I think there are two things we can do about this. One is the approach that Alan Gross has taken, and just stop using the word very much, and pursue his work under a different label and market it under a different label. And the other one is just to keep doing the fine work that we're doing and getting attention for it. And I think that's the best way to go. I think in the area of medicine in particular, it's been very effective in that clinicians, health practitioners, doctors have been quite welcoming of rhetoricians. And the word in the medical disciplines, rhetoric is quite a wholesome word these days. So I think we just need to keep doing that sort of work. I published another book, Rhetoric and Incommensurability, a few years ago, and that one was explicitly trying to attract sociologists and historians and philosophers of science to the work that rhetoricians could do, because incommensurability is a problem, I think, that rhetoricians are particularly well suited to investigate. And it's a superb book. I have a number of contributors to it who just did spectacular work. John Campbell, who's done amazing work throughout his whole career. I think his finest essay amongst all his fine essays is in that volume. It's a really good book, mostly because I was a ringmaster and not because I did anything particular myself. But in any case, I published it to draw the attention of rhetoricians to sociologists and philosophers of science and historians of science, and it got a couple of good reviews, and then I didn't hear anything back. And then last year, out of the blue, I got an invitation, because of that volume, to do a keynote address to a conference on incommensurability by sociologists and historians and philosophers of science. So slowly the work is percolating. I think all we have to do is do good work, call it what it is, rhetoric, and people will start to appreciate it.
And what do you see as your biggest contribution to the field?
Well, aside from a few scattered essays of various sorts, I think the 2 volumes, landmark essays in Rhetoric of Science, case studies, and Rhetoric and Incommensurability are my major contributions, and mostly, again, because I serve as a kind of ringmaster, gathering together this amazing contingents of rhetoricians. The first one, the landmark essays volume, collected really the foundational essays by folks like Michael Halloran and John Lyne and Henry Howe and Alan Gross and Jeannie Fanistock, Larry Prelly, all the really finest foundational, Chuck Baserman, foundational essays in the field. And I knitted them together with an introduction, and it served the discipline very well, I think, as a training ground for new rhetoricians of science and technology and medicine. And the other volume, Rhetoric and Incommensurability, again, this time not essays that already existed, but essays I commissioned around the question of incommensurability, again bringing in Larry Prelly and Alan Gross and Carolyn Miller and Jeannie Fanistock and Chuck Baserman, all to tackle the problem of incommensurability, mostly through case studies, to show how effectively incommensurability is not, as philosophers have long held, namely a problem of these 2 incommensurable objects, theories that can't be brought together, but more an issue of the theorists who can't find a way to adjust their ideas to each other, mostly because they aren't particularly interested in finding a way to adjust their ideas to each other. It's an unfortunate byproduct of controversy, I guess, that it's epistemically productive. So people argue with each other, they object to each other strenuously, and one of the ways they do that is to build their own programs up, to inoculate them more and more against criticism, and they get better and stronger and more robust theories and approaches through not agreeing with others. But it's the theorists who make the incommensurability, not the theories that are incommensurable in the first place. And I think rhetoricians are extraordinarily well suited to point that out and to show how these theories developed through the theorists negotiating with each other, taking bits and pieces of each other's packages and building up their own theories against the attacks of others that make the knowledge.
That's also a good answer to the question I want to ask more pointedly now, which is what does rhetoric add to studies of science and technology? So that there's one sense in which it can address this issue of incommensurability. Are there other parts of the rhetorical lexicon? You hinted at, talked about figuration early on. Are there other terms that you see as particularly valuable in adding to our studies of science?
Well, a lot of the whole machinery of rhetoric in the entire tradition, figures, topoi, notions of kairos and decorum and structure, and the whole repertoire of rhetoric is extraordinarily well suited to look at science. And I think the question's actually a bit backwards. We ask this question because we are a not especially well appreciated discipline. But rhetoric is the study of symbol-using animals. We're all symbol-using animals, and we use our symbols to get along with each other, to not get along with each other, to build knowledge, to build tools, to find our way in the world, and scientists do this as much or more than anybody. They use symbol systems to understand the world and to build tools and to make claims and make knowledge. So the question really ought to be, what do sociologists and philosophers and historians add to the study of science? We are studying the material of science, how science is made through its symbol systems. Now, as it turns out, the sociologists and historians and philosophers do add a great deal to the study of science, and they do it through their own symbol systems and their own negotiations and their own interpretive deterministic screens. So I'm not saying that sociologists and historians and philosophers and psychologists of science and literary critics of science don't have a place as well, but the fundamental discipline for looking at science is and ought to be rhetoric.
Can I invert my question then and ask, what does science add to the study of rhetoric?
Well, it gives us an object of inquiry that shows how powerful our tools are. So science is the place where our most robust pieces of knowledge are made, our most robust understandings of the world, and they're made through rhetorical processes. So by studying science in the same way that we, or very much the same way that we study politics or other kinds of social negotiations, we show that it's a refinement of that science is a refinement of the same tools we use in our regular negotiations and arguments with each other. So that by studying science, we demonstrate how powerful the tools of rhetoric are.
What are the future directions, either in terms of topics or methods, do you see for rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine research?
Well, the clearest areas that I think that are on the horizon are those that involve new technologies of communication and suasion and symbol making and symbol using and symbol misusing. I think one of the ways to approach it is through notions of orality. Walter Ong's work on orality and literacy investigated how there are different personal and institutional and social thinking styles and reasoning styles affected by the presence of print or the absence of print, so that oral cognition is a different sort of way of looking at the world than print cognition. And Ong, along with other people at similar time, Marshall McLuhan stands out probably most prominently, saw that the electronic media of the time, radio and television principally, was having an effect on cognition and thinking styles and reasoning styles as well. And Ong coined the term secondary orality for what was going on, what these new electronic media were adding to our cognitive styles. And he was certainly onto something, and so was McLuhan with his global village ideas. But with the digital overlay on top of the electronic media, with social media, with Twitter and Facebook and even email, we see that these notions of secondary orality, this sense of communication and thinking in a different, more integrated and flowing, as opposed to strictly linear sort of style coming to the fore. So their insights sparked by television and radio, I think, could be applied very fruitfully to new social media.
Finally, do you have any sage advice for young researchers just starting out in the field?
Well, I'd like to see them pick up cognitive directions, of course, because I think that's an extraordinarily fruitful way to look at how we understand each other and how we make knowledge, and consequently how scientists understand the world and each other and us and make knowledge. But frankly, I wouldn't presume to tell people how to build their world and their careers at this point. They have a much better sense of what's going on and what's coming than I do. I can only hope that the work that some of us have done can be repurposed and reintegrated into their pursuits.